to have like a very strict hour-and-a-half policy that you need to cram everything in. We don't exactly have that, so I can go into a whole lot more detail about stuff and the history and crap. And I don't have to watch my language as much, which is awesome. I can say things like history and crap. That's great. So, the history of Sydney starts way back in the early 1600s. This was prime fishing ground for the English, the Spanish, and the French. For decades, people would come over, fish during the summer months, and leave. No permanent settlements were established until the late 1600s, when the French kind of started making semi-permanent homes here. When that started happening, the English also started making semi-permanent homes, and territorial disputes started getting more intense. At that point, the Spanish got smart and like, we see where this is going, we're gonna peace, and they left. But we still have some of their history here, like Spanish Bay is just out that way, and it's named because that was their fishing grounds. That's where they'd come over for 4 months of the year. Everything was kind of up in the air between the English and the French until 1713. That's when the first official declaration of land ownership was established, called the Treaty of Utrecht. The English and the French got together and decided who owned what. And Cape Breton Island was owned by the French. And it was the only piece along the Atlantic coast that was owned by the French. However, they got all the Gulf of St. Lawrence and Quebec in that area. New Brunswick was still up in the air. They couldn't come to agreement on who owned it, so it just kind of stayed in limbo. The deal worked out in the French land-wise. They got a whole bunch in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The problem is they had no way of protecting it except for Cape Breton. So that's when they decided to start building the fortress of Louisbourg in 1713, along with the Treaty of Utrecht. The French had a very weird way of doing things. They were like, if it's not French, it's not good. So in order to build the fortress, they went to northern France, cut and quarried, and designed the entire fortress over there, loaded it on ships, shipped it across the ocean, unloaded it, and rebuilt it like a giant Lego set.
What?
And for over 10 years, it was just ship after ship after ship of brick shipments. And if you look from the quarry where they were digging up in France to Louisbourg, it's a straight line right across the Atlantic.
Oh, really?
They just had to follow it,
Interesting.
and they'd land off, and they didn't want anyone getting lost. So where they cut and quarried and loaded it, they just went in a straight line, and they'd end up in Louisbourg. And they re-established it. So that's how Louisbourg was built. It was all constructed out of stone made from northern France.
Wow.
Now, depending on which history you listen to, either two things happened. One, the French settlers were getting bored, and they decided to go, hey, you know what? There are English ships here. Let's steal their goods. And they'd come and pirate them. The French side of things is, no, we never did that. The English would come in and like harass us and tell us to get lost. So if you believe the English, the French were stealing their goods. If you believe the French, the English were making it all up. So there's no solid what happened.
Guy, can you vouch for any of that?
I'll go with the French stole. That makes more sense to me.
But so during this, the English were like, okay, we don't take too kindly to this. So in 1728, there was a big attack on the fortress of Louisbourg. The man who was running it at the time was smart. He saw there was no way of him winning. They snuck up from behind and pretty much boxed them all in. And within 4 weeks, they said, you know, okay, we surrender. We don't want any more trouble than it's caused. Let's try to make this happen. So the English then won the fortress of Louisbourg for 4 years. Then another treaty was signed, which gave it back to the French. And the man who took over this time was far, far, far more stubborn. And when the next war happened in 1755, he didn't back down so easily. And that siege lasted 7 weeks. And when the English finally took over, they decided, you know what, we're just gonna have to give this back in another treaty. We don't want to do that. So let's just sack the whole place. And they tore everything down. And it left the biggest rubble heap on the Atlantic coast. Now, even though it was a rubble heap, it was still really, really good stone. So a lot of stone is used in buildings in town. Not only that, people would come up from New England, gather it, and go back down.
Oh, wow.
There's an entire community called Louisbourg Square in Boston, which originally was constructed entirely out of Louisbourg stone. There's a community in both New York and New Jersey made out of Louisbourg stone as well. So people would just come up, grab a bunch of stone, go back, and it was good quality stuff, and they didn't need to pay for it. So why not take it? After the English took over after the 1755 battle, there was still a huge population of French living here. They weren't exactly French loyal, though. They were known as the Acadian. People who lived in Louisbourg, they were for France. They were the officers, they were the high class. They were people that were on this new land for France. The Acadians, however, their ancestors came over to hunt, fish, start a new life. They weren't making it too great in France, so they thought they'd try it in a new world. And they actually did pretty well for themselves. They got along fantastically with the native population, the Mi'kmaq. They had great relations. They built their farms, they fished, and after a few generations, they decided just to distance themselves from France, because most of them had never seen France. They were never going to see France. They decided, you know what? We're not loyal to this French place. Like, we're our own people. We are the Acadiens. So the French loyalists in Louisbourg, they all took off back to France or down the Gulf of St. Lawrence, but the Acadian, who weren't loyal to France, just kind of hung around. English colonel called Colonel, I believe it was Baxter William, something along those lines. He was charged with setting up a military force in Cape Breton for the English, and when he arrived, he had all these French-speaking folks here. And he figured, this isn't good. These are French. If history shows anything, we're going to go to war with these people, and we're vastly outnumbered. So he gathered up all the Acadian leaders and said, okay, we own this island now, but I'll make a deal with you. If you sign this letter stating your loyalty to the Queen of England, then, or I guess King of England at that point, you are allowed to stay, and when the fight starts, you just fight for us, and like, no problem. Acadian leaders like, we didn't fight in the last 2 wars you guys had. Why would we fight for you? Like, no. If you guys want to duke it out, by all means go ahead. We want nothing to do with it. We just want to live our lives. We don't care. And Colonel said, fine, whatever. We'll deal with that. But he wasn't fine with it. So one Sunday morning, as the Acadians were all going to church, his army surrounded all their churches, locked them in, knocked on the door, and said, we'll give you 2 choices. You can either come out with us, or we burn down the buildings with you inside. So, as far as I'm aware, none of the buildings were actually burned down, but they all did go with them. And at that point is what's known as the expulsion of the Acadians. The colonel came in, separated families, threw them on ships, and just sent them away wherever. These weren't really seaworthy vessels, they were old
So this
schooners.
was turning around when?
This was late 1700s,
Okay.
before 1800s.
Okay.
It was roughly 1770s,
Okay.
give or take.
Yeah.
And so gathered them all up, separated families, they shipped them all away. There's like documents of people trying to get back here. But the thing is, because the English owned so much of the coast, any boats that were sent around the coast, they had to go down all the way around through the Gulf of Mexico, and they actually ended up in Louisiana. And the Acadian that crashed there then became the Cajun. The Cajun population are actually expelled Cape Bretoners. And so a lot of them tried to go back, didn't make it. There's Acadian National Park in Maine. And what that is during the expulsion of the Acadians, some of the Acadians were being bad and didn't go to church that morning, and they heard what happened. So they ran on foot to try to catch their family and friends. And as far as they could make it before winter was Maine, and was now Acadian National Park. And that's where they had to hold up. Now, some families did get together, a lot didn't, and there's actually the really famous poem Evangeline, which is all about that. So yeah, that's how a lot of the French got expelled from Cape Breton. Flash forward into the early 1800s, the Acadians are still in hiding. In order to suppress the French population from coming back, they've banned the Catholic religion. They're only allowed to be Anglican here. A man named Joseph de Bauer, he is charged with, okay, we have a military settlement on Cape Breton, that's fine and good, but we want an actual English settlement where people can start breeding and producing good, strong English stock. And he's like, okay, I can do that. Sure. Bauer was a photographer, and a really, really good one. So he'd been all through Cape Breton before. He drew maps. They were used worldwide for many years, his work. And during this time is when the loyalists from the States were being exiled as well. So he went down during the summer, gathered up a whole bunch of loyalists, and said, okay, we're going to go start a new settlement in this Cape Breton place. Back then it was known as Isle de Royale, still hadn't changed. So they come up, and they really, really want to get settled before winter, but they couldn't make it. So they ended up needing to hold up in the ruined fortress of Louisbourg for that winter. Fun fact, Sydney is actually supposed to be over there in Westmount, because Bauer came and observed the lands and found the best soil and everything, and it was all over in Westmount. However, as they were coming over from the spring, they were beaten out by a very wealthy family, who then claimed the land. They were English as well, and had a lot of influence, and started building up their own businesses. And rather than allowing them to join, they're like, no, we're going to make a whole bunch of money off this place. You find your own spot. So across the harbor, they started up Sydney. And the family and Bauer, they didn't get along at all. In fact, Bauer was really good friends of the main priest for St. George's Church. And when the father of the family passed away, they wouldn't allow him to be buried in the graveyard. So he's actually buried in Peter's Field on his own little lot, because they wouldn't allow him in. But Bauer lived to be... Yep, he lived to be 102. And
Christmas.
yeah, and story goes, well, he had to go into hiding for a while. He got in trouble. He was very, very loyal to his people that he brought up here. He felt responsible for them. And Sydney winters, especially back then, were really harsh. So one year he had to call in a shipment of food because they just didn't have enough to make it through the winter, and they were all going to die if they didn't get it. So he had to call in a shipment. He charged it to the Crown. The Crown didn't appreciate that. So he said, okay, this is all coming out of your pay, don't let it happen again. So for about 2 or 3 years, he went without making a cent because he had to get that much food for everyone. Several years after that, they're running low on food again, and he did the same thing. After that, they weren't as lenient with his punishment, and he had to take off. He went down to Halifax and started businesses and establishments there, and we don't know too much about what happened.
He was hiding, I suppose.
Yes. But on his 100th birthday, he resurfaced, and he got up on the bar stand and started dancing, because he lived to be 100, and he got bragged audaciously that entire night that he was able to outlive all of his enemies. So he was quite proud of that, and apparently danced on the bar that night. Passed away 2 years later. Sydney, well, that's the kind of borderline start of Cape Breton and then Sydney. And now we can go see some cool places. Now we're going to start right over here.
Wow.
Okay.
This is a museum I usually work at.
This isn't a church anymore.
No.
So this is one of the oldest churches in Cape Breton. It was here 1828. Now it's a museum, but it was here.
There's wax on all of those. Yeah, we're trying our best.
How's it going?
Good.
Good. This is family. from away.
Awesome.
And they're like, hey, go to Sydney. And I was like, okay. So I'm from Sydney.
Did you go to costumes yet?
No, not yet. We just started down there. Yeah. The horns on the back freaked me out.
Yeah, it was weird.
This is the first Roman Catholic church?
No, this is the oldest still standing Catholic church. There would have been a church in because Catholic religion wasn't allowed in Cape Breton because they didn't Captain John too much. He was an English officer and Anglican. His wife Margaret, however, was Irish Catholic. And the idea of burying her child in an Anglican graveyard deeply upset her. So Captain John, being the gentleman he was, he took a small lot of his land, awarded to him by the English government, and made her a small Catholic graveyard where they buried the child. Only 3 original boards left. The stonework you see is all original, and most importantly and impressively is the roof.
That's original?
Yep, I mentioned earlier that the building had to be constructed by volunteers because they couldn't afford to pay anyone to build it. And among their volunteers, they didn't have any actual contractors, building builders, that sort. They did have a handful of shipbuilders though. So for the roof, they constructed the hull of a ship and flipped it upside down. It's completely waterproof, doesn't make a sound in the wind. It's held together entirely by wooden pegs, and other than a few small repairs done over the years, it's the exact same roof that was up here in 1828.
Awesome. Like over two.
Shortly after its restoration, it was purchased by the Old Sydney Society and converted to a museum rather than a parking lot, and it has remained so until its present day. So that's kind of the basic overview of this building and site.
That's good that they were able to save it. Yeah. So almost 200 years now. That
Yeah, 190 this year.
Wow. That's awesome.
Feel free to look around. If you have any questions, ask. If you don't believe my answer,
Oh yeah. Careful there. Don't step on.
Well, it's church. That might ignite.
So this is through the Esplanade.
Mm-hmm.
1900. So this street.
Yeah.
And this is the church, I'm assuming, right?
It's not good enough. Or cleaning or
Nice.
oh my goodness. That's in
I
pets?
decided to put a furnace in.
That's St. George's.
Okay.
Third floor.
Yeah.
They take up the floor and dig a hole for the furnace.
Holy angels are
It's all
there.
from Dandy.
Ah,
Here.
I wonder what that was.
They got here, underneath this altar.
Yeah, I was
here.
wondering if they were actual,
Remains
because
only
I didn't, I couldn't recognize
So
some of them,
these
but I
are
did
called in
recognize
and
like.
made sure that.
Like most of them are like actual.
They were
These
pioneer
are the
graves.
cutest houses.
And among
I
them, they
love
found
Like a picture.
about 6-foot tall man wearing a colonial
Oh.
and a small and we believe that was the grave of Captain John Butler Wilson and the small child that started it. So all 8 bodies were reburied, full Catholic and Anglican burial rites, and to specifically mark Captain John and the child, we placed the only 3 remaining 4 at the top of their graves. So Captain John's here. And the other 8 bodies are current. Or other 6 bodies.
And I said, well, church is looking kind of empty, so I'll redecorate, so I put all them out. And then Joyce was like, I'm gonna paint them, and I said, please don't.
Please don't leave it at the bank. We really
No, she like literally looked, as she walked in, she was like, I've never heard like boo or heave about these.
I was telling Sheila when they expanded this part out, in the 1980s, they were digging down to put a furnace
Oh,
in
no.
instead of having the dirt crawl space. When they hit there, they unearthed 8 bodies, and we believe is that they extended out over the graveyard because back then the theory was closer to church, closer to God when you're buried. So we think that they moved the headstones, but not the graves, which is why we found the body of an
Right.
infant child of undetermined gender and a tall 6-foot man in English colonial officer wear. And so we moved their 2 stones over here and left the bodies under the church. In its heyday, I guess still to this day, there were almost 300 bodies buried in this graveyard. They're clearly not 300 stones. And a lot of that is, 1, people were poor, and 2, they would get stones, but during the big boom of the steel plant, a lot of houses were being built. Houses need keystones. Protestants don't really care all that much about Catholic graves, so turns out headstones make great keystones. And they'd steal them and use them in the foundations of their houses. And people would be doing renovations in their house this day, blow at a wall, flip up a stone, and there's writing on the back. Like, oh crap. So quite often they bring it to us and try to guess
Figure out,
what it was. There's a few of them in behind towards the washroom inside the building, but they're mostly chips and fragments where people have blown out the rock. So that's why it seems smaller, but in actual fact I believe there's 297 people buried in this area. Because not only was this the only Catholic church, this is the only Catholic graveyard. So they needed a place to be buried.
So
That's
what?
awesome that this is.
So do you think that some of these trees could be covered? Like,
Oh yeah, when they put
Yeah.
in this ramp here, they found 6 more bodies. And that was just in 2008.
imagine, eh?
Yeah, like this,
So they
So
really got to be careful.
I'm assuming, yeah, they probably had the right people.
yeah. They called in the police and made
Yeah.
sure the bodies weren't of a certain vintage, and
Right.
they weren't.
Yeah.
All bodies that had been unearthed were reinterred. Those 8, those 6.
Right.
There's a plethora of them in these grounds.